Do you want to learn how to go from this to this? Well, you're in the right place because today I want to teach you how to make the perfect build for whatever build idea you have in mind. I'm going to be going through the step-by-step process that I go through whenever I'm making my own builds, so that way you know how to create a viable, fun, and impactful build. I'm going to be using this Raging Swarm build as my example. It's a build that I've crafted for Graves recently that, as I'm sure you've seen on the channel recently, has been very successful in Eterna's lobbies, and I'm going to be showing you the step-by-step process for how I went about crafting and perfecting this build. So the first step in creating a build is to have a succinct and clear plan for what it is exactly you want to do. In this example, I want to create a minion-focused Graves build that maxes out the Jar of the Dead and Borrowed Decree to do as much damage as possible and just overwhelm the enemies with a ton of minions. And so, once we have that goal in mind, we need to just figure out what items can help us achieve this goal. Now, discussing what every single item in the game does is well beyond the scope of this video, but lucky for you, I already have a video discussing what each and every item does and showing the best use cases for them. So if you want to watch that video, a link will be in the description. Now, when I'm thinking of the best items to put into my build, I first have to identify what type of archetype the build is. Is it a spirit damage build, a gun damage build, some kind of tank build, or support build? And in this case, for Graves, I am making a spirit damage build because Jar of Dead and Borrowed Decree are both heavy spirit damaging abilities, so I'll want a lot of items that complement that. Furthermore, since we are trying to play a lot around the Jar of the Dead and Borrowed Decree, we have to think of ways to augment these abilities in particular and play around their unique effects. For example, it's worth noting that Jar of the Dead is a charged ability, and we get charged by picking up death around us, so having ways to get extra charges is probably a good thing to have in this build. So to begin our build crafting journey, I first just create one very big category here, and then go into the weapon, vitality, and spirit categories and just throw a bunch of items in that I think will be helpful. So I just look and identify any items that could be useful for me. Extra spirit? Yeah, that'll be useful. Extra charge? Sure. Mystic expansion? Well, it could improve the targeting range on the Jar of the Dead. That's a maybe. I'll throw it in for now. Arcane surge could be good because it boosts the duration of Borrowed Decree and gives us extra stamina. Compressed cooldown and duration extender are both going to be good for the ultimate. Improved spirit is also fantastic. Mystic vulnerability could be good. Mystic slow? Maybe. We can put it in for now. And we can just keep throwing in a bunch of items and also upgrades to the existing items in here and just lump it all together in one big category. So we'll finish off our spirit items here by picking up Boundless Spirit and Escalating Exposure, both of which are fantastic. And, well, we can also think about some unique items here that could potentially be very powerful. Echo Shard, for example, could be very interesting on the Jar of Dead if it actually gives us one extra charge and doesn't really hurt our economy. And so that's something we can actually test here while we're throwing items into our build. And so we can just come over here in the sandbox, imbue Echo Shard on our Jar of Dead, throw out a Jar of Dead, then Echo Shard it and see that, oh yeah, we do get our charge back. We can just have double the minions out here. Okay, Echo Shard might be a phenomenal item. So let's keep that in the build. And since Echo Shard does that, Refresher could probably be pretty good too, so let's put that in, possibly as another sort of situational item. But of course, the build can't just consist of purples. We do have to get some greens and probably some gun items as well. And so when you're thinking about items in your other categories besides your main spirit category, you usually want to think about them in terms of your investment spikes. Investment spikes are very important to hit because they give you a major bonus to your vitality, gun, and spirit damage. For example, here I've hit my spirit investment spike thanks to Echo Shard, and I have 38 extra spirit power as a result, and you'll notice that jump from 3.2k to 4.8k is substantial. We go from 19 to 38, double the amount of spirit power, and the same is true for vitality here. We go from 275 at 3.2k up to 525 at 4.8k, and then for gun damage we go from 20% up to 49%, more than double. So these weapon investment spikes are super important to hit, and the way you do that often involves comboing 3 tier 2 items, 1 tier 3 and 1 tier 2 item, or just going for a tier 4 item in some cases. Now when we're thinking about vitality items here, our main goal is to improve our sustain and also focus on fixing up some of our weak points. So Graves here is a very slow character. She has some of the worst mobility in the game, so that's something I definitely want to remedy with some green items. We could get Enduring Speed, which is a nice cheap 2k, gives us a lot of extra move speed and also reduces reduces the effect of movement slow, or we could also shell out a bit more money and go for Stamina Master, which could be interesting, although if we do already have Arcane Surge in the build, there is a potential for Stamina Mastery to be a bit redundant, especially because it is also expensive, but we'll put it in as a maybe for now. And then for some sustain, for some healing, we do have some options, but I think Spirit Lifesteal makes the most sense, since we are playing a Spirit build. This will give us a little bit more Spirit power, and it'll also, most importantly, give us a bunch of healing when our dead heads and our ultimate start attacking. And then, well, that gets us up to 3.2k. How could we get up to our 4.8k investment? Well, we would just need another tier 2, and there are a bunch of options here. We could go for Enchanter's Emblem, which gives more spirit power and ability cooldown reduction. That could be good. Let's try putting that in the build. Debuff Reducer is a nice situational. We might put that in the situational category later. Let's go ahead and put that in the build. Same with Reactive Barrier. And then Healbane. Now this could be a really good item here because anti-heal is super important. We'll be able to spread that easily with the Jar of the Dead, and this also gives us spirit power and even more healing. I think Healbane is definitely the best choice here, so let's put that in the build too. And we can make a separate category later on in the build where we just chuck things like Bullet Resist, Counterspell, Dispel Magic, all of our situationals, but we don't need to clutter up the main focus of the build with that right now. And then for weapon items, this can definitely be a tricky challenge when you're coming up with a spirit build, because a lot of gun items simply don't synergize with spirit builds. Like, what, are you gonna get Intensifying Magazine for your spirit build? I don't think so. But luckily for Graves, we do have some very good options here. So remember what I said, you have to think about your abilities and what would synergize with them best, especially synergizing with their unique properties. So Jar of Dead here is a charged ability, and any charged ability is going to be made better with Recharging Rush, which is a brand new item that will allow you to replenish a charge for each of your charged abilities when you deal weapon damage. This sounds like a fantastic item if indeed it does work with the Jar of the Dead, and that is always a big if because, well, hey, some charged abilities don't necessarily work this way. Wraith's cards, for example, don't really proc with Recharging Rush, so will this actually give us our death or not? Let's test it out. We can buy Recharging Rush, and let's just get, I don't know, any old 6k. Let's get Spiritual Overflow, sure, why not? Just to make sure I have enough gun damage. And then, do some gun damage. And oh yep, Recharging Rush procs and gives us an extra Jar of the Dead. Okay, this is probably a really good item to have. But we probably don't want to invest in too many other tier 2s, because one thing we have to keep in mind for a build such as this is slots. This build already has a lot of items in it, and of course a lot of these items upgrade into each other, but we could still very well run out of slots. If I just go ahead and buy a bunch of these different items here, go ahead and get my Vitality Spike online here with 3 tier 2s, and yeah, we really only have 2 slots left right here, and that's assuming we get all of our walkers down. That's pretty hefty, and I still have a lot of items here on the table, like Escalating Exposure, so I definitely want to get a tier 3 here instead of a tier 2 because, yeah, this is a lot of slots to take up. So what would be the best tier 3 for this particular build? A lot of these give weapon damage, and sure, weapon damage and fire rate and stuff, all that's nice, but it doesn't really synergize with our Jar of Dead or Borrowed Decree, and so an item like Hunter's Aura or Weighted Shots probably won't be great. We could go for Toxic Bullets. This definitely does have some synergy. We get spirit damage, and we also get even more anti-heal. That could be an option. The other thing we could do that would synergize really well with our minions, though, is Heroic Aura. Assuming Heroic Aura applies to our Jar of Dead, which we can go ahead and test. So throw out a Jar of Dead, and then pop Heroic Aura, and oh, that looks like it did something, and yes, they do attack faster. So we've done some item experimentation here with Heroic Aura, Echo Shard, and Recharging Rush. All 3 of these are a go, and all 3 of these seem to be pretty powerful, so we are definitely going to put them in the build. So at the end of this item brainstorming session, we should have a build that looks something like this. It is a total mess, and this is where we need to refine the build order for the early game, mid game, and late game, and also make a category for some experimental items that we're going to test at some point or another throughout our matches. So we can go ahead and make some new categories here, a mid-game category and a late-game category, and we can start to separate some of our items out here. So what I usually do during the stage is just take all my 6Ks and put them down here for now, because most of these will end up being late-game purchases. And then for the mid-game, we can put a lot of our big tier 3 items as well. So our superior cooldown, superior duration, stuff like that, just to make things a little bit easier for us. And we still have a lot of items up here in the early game. Some of these, as I mentioned, are probably going to end up being situationals. So Enchanter's Emblem, Debuff Remover, Reactive Barrier, we can put these down here for now. And yeah, we almost have our build whittled away here. But this is still a very bloated early game category, so how are we going to solve this? Well, this is going to require a little bit more experimentation as you figure out your early game build order. And something we can do in the early game, by the way, is consider how fast we can get our 4.8k Spirit Spike online. We will overshoot this throughout the match because this is primarily a Spirit build, but getting it online super fast in the early game is a great way to win our lane even harder, because we'll get that big power spike and we'll do a bunch of extra damage. And so we can try and make this happen by getting a couple of tier 1 items and a couple of tier 2 items, or possibly even rushing a tier 3 item if it is important enough. And furthermore, some of these items we can kind of whittle out through process of elimination just by thinking for a moment about how impactful they actually will be. Mystic Expansion, for example, here provides 20% ability range. If we were to put this on the Jar of Dead, it would improve the search range, the dash range, and also the range at which we pick up our death. But I mean, how much is that giving us really? It's giving us about 1.4 meters of extra search range, and it is giving 3 meters extra dash range. That seems helpful, but compared to our other options, like Arcane Surge, Compressed Cooldown, Extra Charge, stuff like that, it seems like it probably just isn't worth taking up a slot, because our other options here, well, Arcane Surge is going to give us extra ability range on top of all its other benefits. Compressed Cooldown and Duration Extender are going to give way more uptime on Borrowed Decree, just due to the nature of how the numbers work. Extra Charge is going to give us just more deadheads and more spirit power. It seems like that's not going to be super good. And then Mystic Slow as well can be whittled out through process of elimination by the simple fact that, well, we already have Mystic Slow on the tier 2 of Jar of the Dead. This gives us a 30% slow, so, I mean, this would slow them down even more, but it's just probably not worth going out of our way for that. And now we have an early game category that just fits in one line here. So we can whittle this down even further. This is where we need to think about which ability we're going to prioritize in the early game and making sure we get that online as quickly as possible. And we can't prioritize Borrowed Decree in the early game because we aren't going to have our ultimate online right away, and even if we do get our ultimate online quickly, it's just not going to be that impactful without getting a bunch of upgrades later on down the line. So the Jar of Dead in the short term, especially on lane, is going to be much better for us. And this is also because, by the way, our tier 1 here gives us healing for collecting death. So not only is this good for damage, it is our sustainability on lane too. So we're going to want items that complement the Jar of Dead. So, Compressed Cooldown and Duration Extender, we can move those to later because we're going to put those on the ultimate. That definitely makes the most sense for that. This thing scales really well with cooldown and also duration. And then that leaves us with Extra Spirit, Extra Charge, Arcane Surge. Okay, this is also kind of another ult-based item, so we can move that down here. Improve Spirit. Okay, that's going to add some damage and healing. That's good. Mystic Vulnerability, we can probably move a little bit later, but now we don't really have the ability to get our 4.8k online. This is only a couple of spirit items. But if we were to move Rapid Recharge up here, what this would do is give us a bunch more charges. We get 2 ability charges, faster time between charges, 14% cooldown reduction for our charged abilities, and 10 bonus spirit power for our charged abilities. Now, will the cooldown reduction actually work on Jar of Dead? Well, we can do some experimentation to find that out. I'll save you the trouble and just say that, yes, we can actually boost the pickup rate of Jars of Dead by improving the cooldown reduction. So this is just a phenomenal item for us, and together, Rapid Recharge and Improved Spirit get us up to the Spirit investment threshold where we will be very strong. So that's pretty good. And then after that, we have an easy build path into our Vitality and also our gun spike. Just like this, we'll have all 3 of our spikes up, And then we'll be able to move on towards just supercharging our Jar of Dead and Borrowed Decree. Now, not every early game is going to be cut and dry, and some early games will require a bit more sustain because the enemies are being aggressive. So, while we may want to rush the gun spike in some lanes, for other lanes we might need a little bit more green. And also, these greens don't really kick in on lane. They don't really provide much for us until later in the game because, well, lifesteal just doesn't scale super well early. Healbane could be nice, but it's dependent on us getting kills, and then Enduring Speed only provides us 2 out of combat regen. So, we'll also need to think about some early game sustain options, and you have a number of choices for these based on which character you're playing. Extra regen and healing right are the 2 most common, but if you're playing a melee character, melee lifesteal can be good. If you're playing someone who has super consistent spirit damage, then Mystic regen can be okay, but this is really niche. It's mostly limited to just like Lady Geist and Mirage, and Graves just doesn't have the consistency to really use this item. Then there is also Restorative Shot, which is great for gun builds, and is also great if you're just able to consistently proc it, because if you're able to consistently hit it on the enemy heroes over and over again, this will actually provide more sustain on lane than an item like Extra Regen. And Graves actually has another very unique quirk about her weapon, which is the fact that it is auto-aim. So, we won't actually waste the Restorative Shot until we latch onto a target, and then it will instantly heal us, making this extremely consistent, and thus actually making it the most impactful sustain item for us on lane. And it's so impactful, in fact, that I usually in my builds just put it at the very start like that. But for whichever character you're playing, you'll probably want to make a separate early game category that has some of these nice early options. This category right here, for example, already has some of our earlier, situational items, and in there we could also just shove a healing right or a rebuttal or something like that, just to make our laning experience a little bit easier. Now, things don't get any less complicated when we enter the mid-game, because figuring out our item upgrade order is very important and rather difficult, especially because you'll also usually want to make some situational purchases along the way. And we do once again have a lot of items in here to whittle away at, and we could even bring some of these 6Ks up into our mid-game build order if they're deemed important enough. So let's try and figure out what we want to do here. Now, we don't want to go overboard with gun damage in this build because it is primarily minion focused. If you're making a hybrid Graves build, then sure, you could have more gun items in it, but this build is primarily spirit minion focused. So we already have Heroic Aura in here. This synergizes better with our minions, so I'm going to say bye-bye to Toxic Bullets. And then we already threw range away earlier, so Greater Expansion is also going to go bye-bye. Now, we do have a lot of green here. We have these 3 greens to get us up to our investment spike, and then we could potentially get more situationals up in here. We just have a lot of green in this build, and Arcane Surge looks really savory, doesn't it? We get 15% duration, 15% range, and 15 spirit power, and this will usually be used to enhance our ultimate, as well as provide us with that 1 extra stamina. I don't want to go too overboard with stamina items because we need every slot that we can get. So, unfortunately, we're going to say bye-bye to my favorite item in the game. Goodbye, Stamina Mastery. So, that leaves us with a bunch of items here, and these are all still really good. We can move the superior cooldown and superior duration to the back, and we could pretty much just order these however we see fit, depending on our priorities throughout the match. Now, Arcane Surge is probably a good item to get online straight away, because it'll just be really good for mobility, as well as, again, enhancing our ultimate with a bunch of really powerful benefits. The bang for your buck on this item is truly just absurd for a build like this. And then after that, we could get even more uptime on the ultimate with compressed cooldown and duration extender, and maybe move the Mystic vulnerability back. Or possibly even move this to a situational category where you buy it if the enemies just have a lot of resistances. But now our mid-game category is just looking a little weak. There's not much going on here. And that's because it is indeed time to bring in some 6Ks. A 6K item is usually a power spike for your build, and you want to try and get a good power spike online so that way you can get active on the map and start just taking out the enemies. So, it's important to think about which power spikes here would suit our character best, and we do have a couple of options here. We have Boundless Spirit, which just provides us with a ton of spirit power, and spirit power is always good on a spirit build. You pretty much can never go wrong with this item. If ever in doubt, I always say, just get Boundless Spirit if you're playing a spirit build. There's also Echo Shard, which, as we discussed earlier, is going to give us a second Jar of Dead, which is really powerful, and it only has a 30-second cooldown, so we can have this up very consistently. Is this going to give us more damage than Boundless Spirit, is the question. Well, let's take a look. So if I just go ahead and buy everything in the build up to this point, then we are at about 20k worth of value, and I have about 64 spirit power from investment, and I also already have improved spirit. If I buy Boundless Spirit, then we go up to 35 spirit power, so just about double improved spirit, and I also get 15% more spirit power. And so if I look at my total spirit power, we have 95 right now. If I buy Boundless Spirit, I go up to 129. That's a substantial increase, but it's not double. And Echo Shard provides us with double, as well as some generally useful stats, Spirit Resist, Bullet Resist, all of that. So, instead of getting Boundless Spirit, we could get Echo Shard, and this will allow us to do a bunch more damage, but it actually is even better than that, because by amplifying and multiplying the amount of minions we have on the field, it reduces the chance that all of our minions will just evaporate instantly. It's much harder for the enemies to kill, well, 12 deadheads than it is for them to kill just 6. And so not only will this double our damage if all the minions are active, but it'll improve our overall consistency in a way that Boundless Spirit will not. And these are the kind of questions you have to think about at this stage when you are considering your power spikes. There are a lot of tier 4s that are really, really good, and you probably will still want to get Boundless Spirit after the Echo Shard, but figuring out which one to pick first requires a little bit of critical thinking skills on your part. So we end up with a build order here that looks like this. We get some basic items online to improve our ultimates consistency, and then we get Echo Shard for our minions, and we get Boundless Spirit as well, and for good measure, we can throw in Escalating Exposure too. Escalating Exposure for a Spirit build really depends on if you're doing Spirit damage over time or Spirit Burst, because it works so much better on Spirit damage over time. And indeed, we are doing Spirit damage over time. These minions all hit the enemies at kind of staggered like this, right? And it's a build-up, and if we hit them with Heroic Aura as well, they're just going to be trickling a bunch of damage and building up that Escalating Exposure super nicely, allowing them to do more than 100 damage per hit. So that's going to be another great item for us. And that is basically our mid-game sorted. By this stage in the game, I have all my slots filled, and I also have spent pretty much all the credits that I'm going to get throughout the match, unless the match goes super duper late. But honestly, this is usually too many slots to take up as guaranteed non-negotiable slots in your build. And that's because you won't always be able to get all of your flex slots online when you want them to be online. And so a good build usually accounts for this and makes some things optional, and also gives you room to buy some situationals. Right now I have no room to buy a situational item. And so then the question becomes, what can we shed from the build? Well, Escalating Exposure is a great damage upgrade, but it is kind of the cherry on top, and it is super late in the build, so by the time we would want this online, we'll probably have the slot for it. And it doubles as a sustain item because it gives us 17% spirit resist, so if we had Enchanter's Emblem, we could literally just swap that out. But Duration Extender here, on the other hand, it is helpful on the ultimate, but it's kind of redundant because we already get duration as well as a whole bunch of other stats from Arcane Surge. So we could definitely shed the duration extender from the build, and we could get duration later on in the game if it's warranted, but by getting rid of that, we now have a slot here where we can slot in some sort of situational item, and yeah, we won't really be losing that much value for it because we're making up for the duration with Arcane Surge. It's very important that you keep your slots in mind and allow yourself to buy situational items, because good counterplay is one of the best skills to have in Deadlock. Even though you're making a set build here, it pays to be flexible and add some flexibility to the build, so that way you can counterplay your enemies effectively. You can have all the damage items in the world, but it doesn't matter if you're dying consistently to a Lash ult because you don't have counter spell. So yeah, make sure that you have the ability to get some situational items when the situation mandates it. So now our build looks something like this. We have an early game category with all of the items to get us up to our 4.8k spikes. That'll also be super helpful on the lane. We have an early situational category for some other items we can buy on lane to help us out if we're struggling. We have category 5, which had some experimental items in it, and if you have any experimental items that you want to test, this is kind of where you'd put them and just experiment with them over the course of a couple of games. Bear in mind that all of these build refining decisions can take place over time as you take a build into matches. So you can play a build once and then decide, I don't really like the build order. I'm going to move Recharging Rush and Heroic Aura to the end over here because I want to get the green spike first. And you can totally do that. Experimentation is a very important part of build crafting. You don't have to theory craft and have a 100% build ready to go before you ever step foot in a match. That's simply just unrealistic. But then we have our mid-game category here where we get our big power spikes online, and then we have a late game category which is filled with miscellaneous items that we can buy when the build is basically finished. And the mid game category is really where the build finishes up because, well, by this point, the game has entered the late game and you should be trying to wrap the game up rather than just now finally getting your build online, right? So these late game items are helpful and they're certainly good power spikes, but they're not the crux of your build. They're not the core, and they're really just, you know, extra fun little things to buy. But then at the end of my builds, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll add a situational category for some items that I can pick up in the mid-game to help me out. Just things like bullet resilience, spirit resilience, counterspell, dispel magic, anything that'll help your character stay alive. Just having them at a glance here signals to your brain that, oh yeah, I should probably buy these counter items at some point throughout the match because I don't want to die. I want to be able to beat my enemies, and this is a good way to do that. Now, in the actual Raging Swarm build, I haven't done this, and this is because I'm at the stage in Deadlock now where I can comfortably just come over here to the item shop and buy the counterplay items manually if I want to, but it is still just convenient, and I'm probably going to go back and add a situational category to that build when this video is over. So now let's clean up the build and make it look all pretty, because an ugly build is simply just hard to use. You don't want your build to be ugly. So let me get rid of this random category, and I can go ahead and move this situational category down next to the other situational category. Already, the aesthetics have improved substantially. And we can also add some annotations here to make it easier to use the build. And this might seem like just an extra thing that's not important, but I do actually really recommend that you annotate your builds and add some descriptions here, just so you know what's going on. Because you might want to share this build with a friend, and that friend will have no idea how to use it, and so some tooltips can be helpful. Or you might come back to this build after an extended period of time, maybe you took a break from Deadlock, or you just haven't played this character in a while, and you want to make sure that you have a description there so that you know what your build is doing. You don't want to come back to this build and just be completely befuddled, because you have no idea what the build order is, or what the purpose of each item is, so annotations are important. So what I usually like to do for these descriptions is just clarify whether or not they are left to right or just buy as you go type of categories, because, well, a situational category like this is not going to have any set build order. It's just going to be, oh, buy it as needed, and so we can tag that as optional and just be like, buy as needed, and these are situational items. And then the early situational category can kind of be the same. So early situational there, and then buy as needed. And then the early game category, we can say generally left to right. Get the green spike before the gun spike if it's a hard early game. Otherwise, you can get the gun spike first, because we want this build to be flexible. If you're already snowballing the early game hard, you might as well get the gun upgrades next, because those are going to help you snowball more than, I don't know, Spirit Lifesteal. Or you may want to do a combination of both. You could even, in the early game here, interweave your items items. So let's say you want to get Enduring Speed first for a little bit of mobility in the early game, then Recharging Rush for economy, and then get your other greens before finally getting Heroic Aura. You could do that too. And I also like to say in the early game category here that you can buy situational items as needed, just as a reminder that you should come down here and get a healing right or a reactive barrier if it's needed in the early game. And the mid-game category is generally the same, but this late-game category over here is not ordered at all because, well, it's the late game. You have already basically completed your build, and so any extra you buy is going to be dependent on the match. And so we'll tag this category as optional and also say just buy as needed and to read the annotation. And this is where we would annotate, oh, refresher, you can buy that if you want to do 2 ultimates and do the epic just zombie swarm combo. Cooldown items are good for overall tempo. Spirit burn is good for anti-heal. You can swap this out for heal bane, superior duration. You know, just explain why you would want to buy each of these items. There's one thing left to do here, and that is figure out the ability point order. And this is another kind of tricky part of the build because sometimes it's hard to know exactly what you want. But, again, this is where you have to just keep in mind the goal of your build. Do you want to make a minion build? Do you want to make a gun build? Do you want to make a crowd control grasping hands build? That will determine the ability upgrade order that you choose. So, for Graves here, we're obviously going to unlock the Jar of Dead first, kind of our most important ability for this build. And then we can unlock Essence Theft after, and the reason for this is because it buffs up our Jar of Dead. We steal Spirit Resist from the enemies, and weapon damage as well. This provides us with sustain on the lane, and also makes them take more damage from our minions. And then we can get the Grasping Hands after that, and then finally cap off with the Borrowed Decree. And then definitely put 1 point into the Jar of Dead for the early game sustain, because we get healing per pickup. This is huge. But now we have a question. What would be better for our overall damage output? Do we max out the Jar of Dead, or do we max out the Borrowed Decree? Well, before we do that, let's put 1 point into the Essence Theft, because this also provides us 5% max Spirit Resist Stolen. That's a damage increase for both of these abilities. But then after that, let's read these upgrades here. So, on hit, Tier 2 will apply 30% slow for 1 second. That's helpful, but is not exactly extra damage. The Tier 3 of this is disgusting. Plus 2 Deadheads, and the Deadheads now trigger Essence Theft. That is a major upgrade. The ultimate, however, will provide us a lot of very powerful benefits. Minus 20 seconds of cooldown, plus 25% ghoul speed, and plus 10 seconds duration. That means more ghouls just across the board. And then the Tier 3 is a major damage spike. So doing a little bit of experimentation here with your build and your character can help you determine what the correct build order is. So at the start, just based on your initial gut instinct, you can choose to say, hey, maybe let's upgrade the Jar of Dead first and then upgrade the ultimate second. And that's totally fair. But then what you can do is after you play a match or two with your character, you can come over to the graphs and figure out what's just doing more damage for you throughout the match, and then decide to prioritize that instead. So in this match of Graves, for example, if we look at the graphs here, you can see that actually our ultimate is by far the biggest source of damage for us, doing more damage than the Jar of Dead consistently at almost every stage in the game. Jar of Dead does catch up here towards the end, but still, the Borrowed Decree is giving us a lot of value. And so, it's probably more worth it then to actually max out the Borrowed Decree first, because yeah, it's doing more work for us. So we can come back over to our build here, and then decide to max out the Borrowed Decree, max out the Jar of Dead second, and then for these final two abilities, it really just depends on what synergizes with our minions more. Essence Theft doesn't really give us anything. We do steal some more weapon damage from them, that can be good for sustain, we could upgrade to the Tier 2 potentially. We don't really need the Tier 3 though, because our minions are already triggering Essence Theft. So we can put 1 point here, and then we can just max out the Grasping Hands after that, because immobilizing the enemies is a great way to ensure that they die to our minions. So there you have it. This is our new Graves build that we created from a blank template that had absolutely nothing on it. We defined a goal for our build, that is to deal a bunch of spirit damage and swarm the enemies with a bunch of minions. And then we used critical thinking and experimentation to deduce the best items for us. We just got a big category with a bunch of items and then played around with them to see which ones would work work best on the character. We ordered them in the early game according to our 4.8k investment spikes, and then got a big power spike in the mid game that makes our character a lot stronger. We also made sure to thoughtfully consider our slots here because we don't want to get overloaded on slots, and we want to leave some room for counterplay and situational items down here. So we ended up whittling out a few items that, while strong, just weren't good enough and were delaying our power spikes and taking up slots that situational items could be in instead. We cleaned up our build and added descriptions to the categories so we understand what exactly is going on here, and added annotations to the items to understand when you would want to buy them and why you would want to buy them. And finally, we determined the ability point order by thinking about which abilities would be helpful to upgrade in the early game before then deciding what we wanted to prioritize going into the mid and late game based on what would be most effective for us. We used graphs and experimentation in actual matches to determine that actually the Borrowed Decree is better to upgrade first and then go to the Jar of Dead second. And you can use these principles to create any build that you want. This is another one of my most popular builds. It's a Ball 7 build, and you can see a lot of the same ideas here. We created an early game category here that has our Spirit Spike with some very helpful Spirit items, as well as some early sustain options and just good lane items with monster rounds and extra regen. Then in the mid game, we focus on getting our Gun Spike and our Green Spike with these items, and also getting a little bit more Spirit Power just to help us farm because we're 7, before finally getting our big Power Spike and then choosing what late game items are best to buy in the individual match, because for some matches you'll want Ethereal Shift more than Escalating Exposure, for some matches you might want Lightning Scroll, or you might just want a little bit of duration and cooldown. The choice is up to you. And then we have situational items here and here just to make your life easier. So hopefully you found this video to be helpful, and if you did, of course make sure to drop a like and subscribe down below so you don't miss out on future videos from me. I just wanted to make a video explaining my thought process for how I create a build, because build crafting is one of my favorite things to do in this game. I did a lot of it when all of the new characters released, and this Graves build is my particular favorite. I spent a lot of time refining it, I experimented with it in matches to make sure that I had the build order just how I wanted it to be, and so you too can do the same and you can create any sort of silly build that you want, prioritizing whatever abilities and play style that you desire. But with all that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all next time. Peace out.